for market, there's a calf with a mournful eye. High above him there's a swallow, winging swiftly through the sky. How the winds are laughing, they laugh with all their might. Laugh and laugh the whole day through, and half the summer's night. Donna, 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 donna. Stop complaining, said the farmer who told you a calf to be. Why don't you have wings to fly with, like the swallow so proud and free? How the winds are laughing, they laugh with all their might. Laugh and laugh the whole day through, and half the summer's night. Donna, 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 donna. Calves are easily bound and slaughtered, never knowing the reason why. But whoever treasures freedom, like the swallow has learned to fly. How the winds are laughing, they laugh with all their might. Laugh and laugh the whole day through, and half the summer's night. Donna, 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 donna.
That was the beautiful voice of Joan Baez, whose music Pete adored. She's there singing Donna, Donna. My name's Pat Stack, and I am chairing this event, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the event to celebrate the life of Pete Gillard, who is already greatly missed by all of us. Obviously, this is a very different memorial to those we will have attended in the past, so I'd like to explain how things will work. Firstly, let me say that everyone is muted and chat is off. It's the online equivalent of asking everyone to turn their mobile phones to silent. Obviously, that does sadly prevent reactions to what is being said by speakers, which I'm sure both speakers and the audience alike will find strange at times, but we hope you will understand why this has to be, and I'm sure it will not prevent us paying the tribute that Pete deserves. Secondly, the event is being recorded, so that Jill George can keep a record. If you speak and you want to be edited out of anything that could be made public, please just let Ian Allenson know. His contact details were in the email providing the details of how to join this call. To anyone that speaks in the open mic session, or indeed in the main speakers, I will tell you when you have 30 seconds left. Sorry we're having to do that, but obviously I can't hand people notes, so I'll have to come in and say so. Today we will have a number of speakers who wish to share their memories of and pay tribute to Pete, and interspersed amongst that, the speakers will be pieces of music that were important to Pete. After the final speaker, we will have an open mic for as many people as possible to say a few words about Pete if they wish to. There will be a 2-minute time limit to allow as many people as possible to speak. You can ask to speak by typing in the chat box, or if you can use the raised hands function on Zoom, then please do use that. I'll repeat all that when we reach the point of the open mic. After the open mic, we will unmute people who can stay for an informal chat if they wish to once the event is formally ended. I'm greatly honoured by Jill, but to be asked by Jill to chair this event. I've known Pete a very long time. We first met when I was a young student. In fact, the first time I met him was at a student conference, and I was very impressed. He seemed very knowledgeable and very left-wing, and I was a young member of the International Socialists, so I decided he would make a very good recruit, and attempted to recruit him, only to find out he'd been a member for 10 years. It was something he never ever let me forget. I think our next main coming together was at the famous Grunwick's strike. We were on the picket line. It became clear that the police were after 2 or 3 of the people in our group. And so Pete somehow organised for the North London Poly minibus to come and pick us up. So we dived into the bus, the police chasing us. But the problem was that people who witnessed this saw us and the police and decided we were agents provocateurs and police spies. And Pete very calmly pointed at me and said, "How many police do you know with 2 artificial legs?" And that sort of got us out of that particular difficulty. So the next thing, my real interaction with Pete was, I used to stay with Pete and his partner at the time whenever I was up in London, and I came to stay for a weekend just shortly before I was due to move to London. And 18 months later, I had become the guest from hell who was still there, having not paid a penny's rent. And when Pete and his partner moved out, I still had the flat. So I owed Pete an awful lot, including the place I was living in. We were together in the Camden branch, and we occasionally had differences, but the great thing about Pete was political differences didn't mean personal animosity, which isn't always the case with people, but he was very good at it. When Pete moved to the United States, I visited him there. I actually left on schedule this time. It was clear that Pete was having a big political impact on the International Socialist Organization in the States. His vast knowledge, enduring patience, and passionate commitment inspiring all those around him. He eventually returned to Britain via various other parts of the world, and we were once again sharing a political group, which we continued to do until dramatic events in 2013 led us both, along with many others, to believe there were principles that far outweighed party loyalty. It was fantastically reassuring, therefore, to find when a new organisation, RS21, was formed, Pete and I were once again fellow comrades. We were here tonight of Pete's great commitment to revolutionary change, of Pete the passionate campaigner, Pete the mentor, and Pete the wonderful man that he was. We are all mourning, but let's also celebrate his wonderful life and then keep on keeping on to make the world a better place, the task he dedicated his entire life to. For our first speaker, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Tony Woodhouse, chair of the Unite Union's Executive Council. It is a real tribute to the role Pete played as a union activist to have Tony speaking at this event. Tony.
Thanks, Pat. First of all, condolences, Jill. I know we want to celebrate Pete tonight and not mourn him. And when I first heard the news, obviously got to me a little bit. I'll tell you, I read one of the testimonials on RS21. And it tells a story not only about Pete being in America, which I didn't know about, and Holland, but when he's in his early 20s, picked up one of the schemes, the top scheme. Now, I come from an era, left here in 72, who will remember the Yob scheme and the YTS and all them schemes that we fought against all our lives. And to tittle and laugh about there's Peter, 20-odd, using the scheme that the government at the time was using to, shall we say, hide the statistics of unemployed youth and pick a project which was computer programming that weren't even on the scene at the time. And it makes me laugh that, you know, here's a scheme that the government was doing to hide the unemployment figures at the time, a political figure that gives Pete a platform, not just for himself, but to help many thousands of other people to fight against the establishment for the rest of his life. And I will dine out on that for the next few years. But it's hard to talk about people, talk about Jill as well, because I only ever knew the two of them together. When I first met Pete and Jill, it must have been, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago. It was prior to the amalgamation between Amicus and the T&J. I used to go on to the Gazette meetings then, which Jill and Pete used to speak about. To say that they had a lot of enemies at the time would be an understatement. And people used to always warn me about these two, watch them out, the trots and everything else that went with it. And I met them, I said, these are the two best activists I've met in my life. These two of the best, you know, they talked to you, they agreed with you, when they disagreed with what they said. And it wasn't always our way or the highway, you could change their minds. But how Peter and Jill went through things was just unbelievable. When we were merging, Amicus wouldn't tell their executive anything. The Transport and General Workers Union told their people everything. And we used to pass the papers over to Jill and Peter to go through them, to pick up anything that we would miss. And they were a great part of that amalgamation that we got through. When it wasn't built on, pick the best of the T&J and pick the best from Amicus. It was what's best for the membership. And how can we build this organisation into a battle to take on the political establishment and get what was best, because without political change, we knew that we were fighting a losing battle. But I had great support of Pete and Jill. You know, the first support was going for the chair of the executive when all the establishments in the unions, both unions, wanted another chair. I had my people on side, but also Peter and Jill supported me. And by the way, that cost Jill a hell of a hard time back in Amicus, along with a few other people who were attacked because of the support of me. And I hope I've tried to pay you back on that, Jill. But one of the things that that was also funny with that, I've never been one for bureaucracy. I hate bureaucracy. And Peter used to embrace bureaucracy and go through it like a fine-tooth comb. And I remember once a policy forum, which, if I had my way, I'd burn the policy forum tomorrow, start from scratch. But we had a policy forum, we had a document that was about 1,000 pages long. We went to the Labour Party conference, we come back, and I was horrified to see a thing out from Jill saying, we sold the NHS out. We sold them out. I was horrified. And straight away, I got in touch with Jill to say, Jill, what's this? The last thing I would do in a million years. And she said, if you look at page, and this is just for thingy now, by the way, it's not the exact page, but if you look at page 975, paragraph 14, add on there, we will give the services first to the NHS, and then what they can do, we will give out. It was one sentence in the book that they had took the time to go through, that we should have took the time to go through, that we should have had people in our unions. It wasn't just the T&J, it was Amicus, it was T&J, it was Unison, it was DMB, it was the CWU. Everybody missed that when I went to the conference and voted for the document that really said privatisation. And that learned me a hell of a lot about how much work them to do. I never made that mistake again, by the way. Never made that mistake again. But when we move on with Pete then obviously done what he done best, and he got onto the rules, Standing Orders Committee in the rules conference. And I always remember the first one we had. Peter was meticulously for detail. I didn't want to know nothing about bureaucracy. And I remember Peter giving me a book by Tereen, the ABC chairmanship, which I said to him, with no disrespect, I can't get past the first 4 minutes of it. My people will be the people in the audience that will guide me how to do the job. But I quickly realised it's not as easy chairing a meeting of 600 people without any rules. But Peter guided me through that, and he guided to me brilliantly. And the only time I think we had a little bit of a disagreement, which didn't turn out a disagreement, was the conference we had over the motion for the General Secretary's payout. To remind people what it was about something that the Amicus FNGP, before the merger, had agreed a payout for Derek Simpson before he left. Wasn't agreed by the Amicus executives, wasn't agreed by the United Executives, it was agreed by the FNGP before we got together. and it was paid out to Derek Simpson by the amicus side before we actually come together as the two unions. And he was a motion.
You start to wind up, Tony, thanks.
Oh, sorry. And he was a motion on the floor, and it was quite simply, the motion was that it could never be done again. I left that until the very end, where Peter thought I was going to leave it. And I brought him 2 hours ago, and Peter went, thank Christ you brought that up, Tony, by the way. He said, I knew you wouldn't let me down. But I've just got to say this. There's thousands of people's lives today around the world who are better off today for the life of both Peter and Jill. And the biggest I can say to them, Peter died in the hospital that him and Jill saved. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you. I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker. Pete's campaigning alongside Jill in defence of the NHS was to feature prominently in his last years. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome John Lister, who's the editor of Health Campaigns Together and the secretary of Keep Our NHS Public, who's probably the leading campaigner in defence of the NHS today and has been for many years. John.
Thank you very much, Pat, and commiserations to Jill. And I thank you for inviting me to talk about Pete. And Jill will know that when I refer to Pete here, I'm also often referring to her. And again, as Tony was saying, I knew them very much together. Although we came from different traditions of revolutionary socialism, I've known Pete off and on for many years, mostly through campaigning work on the NHS. We worked together for a while on attempts in the early 2000s to set up a London region newspaper for what was MSF, I think later to become Amicus. I think it was on the threshold of the merger to become Amicus and Unite. And they wanted me from London Health Emergency to produce a paper for health members in London. This attempt to use the resource of the union to make something happen and to strengthen and inform the membership rather predictably fell foul of the bureaucratic procedures of the day, especially when it came to trying to get hold of any money. And I don't think we ever got an issue of the paper published, although we had some rather enjoyable meetings together. But I saw then that even while he was in the SWP, and we had our differences on that basis, Pete wasn't confined to the more usual propagandist politics and slogans. Pete didn't see campaigning as a way to recruit members, but as a way to make things happen. And when I next became aware of Pete, was after he and Jill had broken with the SWP and relocated to Shropshire. And I followed their progress building Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin to defend our NHS, and turning their constructive political approach that Peter developed to address what was a very different challenge. Many campaigners find it hard building campaigns even in large urban areas with stronger unions and an active left, but Pete and Jill began building what had to be a broad and inclusive campaign in a large rural county which aside from Telford has only got a few scattered small towns, no significant left-wing forces and a very substantial Tory voting population. And the campaign had to fight a major plan, which is still unresolved, for cuts and closures. And Pete saw that these cuts would affect the whole population and that the county's Tory MPs had to be put on the spot, and that could only happen if their own voters were mobilised to fight back. And he recognised that the most powerful lever they could bring to bear in this situation wasn't socialist rhetoric, which of course can feel good for the socialists, but generally leaves the majority of non-socialists to switch off and dismiss them. Pete saw the need to base their campaigning on hard facts, the evidence and the damage that would be done to the NHS locally if the proposals were carried through. And so he and Jill, rather as Tony was describing, meticulously ploughed through all the long, tedious NHS plans and documents, analysed all the proposals, checked the facts, attended the meetings, asked all the awkward questions to tease out more details, and used this to reach out and build the broadest campaign they could. The campaign wasn't knocked off course when we had terrible failures of NHS services exposed in the county in the scandal over maternity care. Again, they focused on the facts, exposed the facts themselves and linked to their criticism of the management of the local hospital trust and the local commissioners, which had failed local people so badly. All this meant that the campaign built up links with local journalists and authority in the local media. Peter developed a style of campaigning that was a far cry from the superficial, shouty sloganising we see too often on the left. We were so lucky and Keep Our NHS Public when Pete was also willing to make the long and arduous journeys from Shropshire to attend our steering committee meetings and later joined and strengthened our executive committee. It was a crucial time. He brought us his campaigning experience and updated, unvarnished reports of what had been achieved in Shropshire at a time when we were actually engaged in a vital fight to rescue Keep Our NHS Public from a determined attempt by a minority to hijack the campaign and drag it off into sectarian negative propagandism. And even while that battle continued in Comp, from the end of 2015 onwards, Pete also stepped forward to become part of the core group who, from Keep Our NHS Public, fought to reach out once more to the unions and build health campaigns together as an even wider coalition. Pete was one of those who immediately got the idea of what health campaigns together was all about. He helped us draft a constitution to protect it as an alliance. He understood the need to reconnect campaigners with national trade unions, which are a link that had been broken for many years, not least in order to sweep away any obstacles to local links with union activists. He grasped the need for the campaign to be political, but not party political. And Pete became therefore a vital ally with others in building health campaigns together. Pete remained rock solid, explaining well to some people who still didn't understand that health campaigns together's successes, of which we had a lot in building the big demonstrations in 2017 and 2018 and big conferences, did not mean we could call the shots with major national unions or take their support for granted. Health campaigns together had to be based on its ability to build united action on issues and demands its affiliates agreed upon. It had to remain a coalition of organisations. Whatever our views as individuals, for example, Pete insisted we should not challenge affiliated unions when they took controversial decisions, for example, on pay deals, which we and others opposed. We had to focus on our unifying role in building an alliance to defend the NHS. Health campaigns together, Pete insisted, should not try to act as a party with its own line or behave as a left group. It shouldn't necessarily even identify as left-wing as such. So Pete formally joined the Health Campaigns Together officers when he succeeded me as treasurer and worked in the last couple of years to build the campaign's union links and win us new affiliations. He also did what he could to encourage, assist and draw in local campaigners in Dorset and other areas around the country. Like me and most of us, Pete could also come over sometimes as grumpy and stubborn, especially to those he disagreed with. But like me, he had another side and liked to laugh. Last year, he and I worked together for several days running a Health Campaigns Together stall at a Unite conference in Brighton. We chatted each day with many people, including many of his former colleagues and contacts in the union. In the evenings, we sat down as two old reform sectarians to have a few beers and a meal together. A lot of laughs and share stories of the old days. I'm so glad now that we had that time. I'm proud to have had the chance to work with him and learn from him. I miss him terribly. As now ally, comrade and friend.
Thank you very much, John. Our next speaker is Sherry Wolf. Sherry is an old friend and comrade of Pete's from the ISO in America, with whom he organised, protested, drank too many beers, and argued in every dive bar of Greenwich City in New York from 1988 till about 2000. She remains a lifelong revolutionary, a socialist organiser, a public speaker, and a general loudmouth and troublemaker living in Brooklyn. Sherry.
Hi, comrades. It's good to see a lot of your faces whom I haven't seen in a long time, and I'm really sorry for the reason why. You know, it's weird. Of course, I'm having this conversation with you in the middle of a pandemic and the beginnings of a global depression. And the lampposts of my neighborhood in Brooklyn are covered with rent strike signs, and from Buffalo to Brooklyn, can't pay, won't pay. And they started to appear a few days before Pete died. And I always think of him when I think of that slogan, which is weird because now they're everywhere in front of me because I had never heard that before. He had introduced me along with a whole generation of Reds and socialists in New York and throughout the US to a whole lot. You know, when I knew him in 1988 to the late 90s or about 2000, we obviously, it's before cell phones, before the internet in the early years. None of us had computers except for him. He was the elder. We were a bunch of 20-something kids who were activists and serious, but we were a handful of people in a giant city who had largely come of age after the explosions of the late 60s and early 70s that shaped him and his generation. And so what he was able to impart was so crucial. He was a generational link for us. And because Pete, you know, with his mischievous smile and his sparkle in his eyes, would launch into a long argument with you about all sorts of things and buy you beers all the while, in the grassroots and in the Holiday and in all the other little dive places and not so divey places, all these village joints, the Ukraine and Veselka's and the little hidden spot in the back that only lefties and Ukrainians knew of, were sites of fierce organizing and political development for a lot of us. And I was thinking about like what stories, you know, the study groups in his apartment were formative for maybe just a handful of us, but that handful actually helped develop, you know, hundreds and thousands. And so his imprint here is so huge. You know, what Tony said about the people who are alive today and the struggles, it's real to me. It's very real to me. I was just sharing online on Facebook when he died, a flyer that he helped me write in 1988 to ACT UP, to the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in New York, that had just formed the year before, putting forth an argument for why we needed to fight for universal health care, perhaps an old story on your front, but you know, you see what we're in. And it was a fight, and he helped form those arguments. He helped shape those words in our fights against police brutality. I was thinking about this visual I have of him. You know, he was huge, tall. I'm pretty tall, but he was taller than me. And people remember the Rodney King beating in 1992. It's the first televised, before there was the internet. You know, somebody had a camera and it went global. Of course, people remember. It was the first time there was a viral image of a black man being beaten by American police. And then when the police got off, there were huge riots that broke out that day in Los Angeles, the site of where it happened. In New York, where we were, the next day, the stock market shut down in the middle of the day and offices were all closed because they were worried that riots were going to happen. And we created a flyer. In fact, Lee Sustar, who just came on to this call, helped craft that flyer and said, riots aren't the problem, racism is. And we made thousands of copies in our offices. I remember Pete and I going into our offices because we both worked in Midtown. And we ran off thousands of flyers and ran out to Times Square because that's where everybody knew to go. And thousands of people were gathering, and Pete is there in his suit and his attaché case. And we handing out these flyers because it's the only thing people have to hold that expresses some scintilla of what people are feeling, the rage. Riots are not the problem, racism is. And for hours, people are marching through the streets, no justice, no peace, no justice, no peace. And when we get to the village, by then it's dark, and the police, as always, are able to rout us because we're separated on these little labyrinthian streets, and they start beating people, and we'd set a rendezvous point in the era before cell phones. We set rendezvous points, right, comrades? And it was the Arch at Washington Square. And I did get hit with my girlfriend, and we were bruised, and we were all ran over to the square, to the Arch, to go find each other so comrades could reconnoiter. And I see him in his suit and his stupid tie, always disheveled, but even more so after hours of marching and chanting, no justice, no peace. With thousands of other people, and he's gesticulating wildly, and I don't understand what he's doing until I get there, and he's pointing to the Empire State Building some 30 blocks, 25 blocks ahead. And in the old days, before mechanization, obviously it was black workers at the Empire State Building who ran the lights, and they turned them red, green, and black in solidarity with Rodney King and against the decision to exonerate the police. And in this moment where we all felt so defeated and kind of, you know, adrenaline pumping from hours of marching and yet getting beaten and whatever and disassembled by the police, to see that, you know, the signature building in New York City is flashing red, green, and black. And he was able to pull joy out of moments. And that was Pete. And I have to say that as somebody who was a young woman who was mentored by him, like so many other people, he never made me feel stupid. I did not know who William Morris was when he and I first had our conversation. And 6 years later, I knew quite a good deal. And then within a week, I had the book from him. And that was Pete. And I end with this, because this is, Lee Sester came into the call, but he really wanted me to just read a sentence or two. And he said, Pete was a rare comrade who managed to convey a wealth of Marxist knowledge that he was always eager to share with younger and less experienced activists. But as someone who organized alongside him for more than a decade, it also want to highlight Pete's skill in, for lack of a better word, how to operate in a wider movement, always on a principled basis, but without covering up political differences, always with generosity and charm. Pete knew that when he arrived in New York in the mid-'80s, he brought with him connections to rich struggle and history that most of us didn't have, and he always shared them. Like many comrades, my relationship with Pete was a formative one, and it was. So thank you, Pete. Rest in power.
Thank you, Sherry. Thanks so much. We're going to have a piece of music now, and listening to this song in 2020, there's nothing obviously progressive about it. But in 1965, when this was a UK hit, Pete had just turned 16, had rejected his dad's politics and indeed his dad's taste for Perry Como, and had become a Marxist. This song represented Pete growing up, and he loved it all of his life. It's the Animals, Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood.
Understand me now, and sometimes I seem a little mad, but don't you know that no life can always be an angel, and when things go wrong I seem a little mad, but I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood. Sometimes, baby, I'm so carefree with a joy that is hard to hide. Then sometimes, seems all I have to do is worry, and you're bound to see my other side. I'm just a soul whose intentions are love. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood. If I seem edgy, I want you to know that I never seem to take it out on you. Life has its problems and I get my share, but that's one thing I never need to do, because I love you. Oh, baby, I'm just human. You don't have thoughts like any other one. Sometimes I find myself alone regretting some little foolish thing, some silly thing I've done. But I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood. Yes, I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood.
Thank you. Pete was an only child, and both his parents died many years ago, but he inherited a large proxy family via Jill, and I'm delighted to hear now from family members, starting with Anne George, who's Jill's sister. Anne.
This is also on behalf of our brother David, who lives with his family in Australia. I first met Pete at a family gathering some 20 years ago. My initial impressions were of a tall, long-limbed man, particularly in relation to my sister, who contributed to and enjoyed the family discussions over the dinner table, and who had a lovely, gentle sense of humour. My other impression was just how happy he and Jill seemed together. And as I got to know Pete better, those first impressions remained and were reinforced by time. He was a tall, gentle man who wore his intellect lightly. Things I'll particularly remember are how he was a great raconteur. He had lots of stories, particularly about his extended time as a student in and around universities, much to the delight of the younger members of the family. His love of gadgetry, not just his smartphone, which he loved, but also a whole range of newly discovered apps that he'd share with us. His equal love of food and wine, many's the bottle of red wine shared with him over the table. His ability to find common ground with every member of the family, young and old, a rare gift. And he had a maverick quality. He took exceptional delight, for example, in getting his final job, which was in the police force, working at a senior level on their IT systems. So much, he said, for their careful recruitment screening processes. Pete himself often told a story of failing to stand up for the national anthem at a baseball game in the States. Some people were insulted and then started to yell "commie" at him. I don't think he was that offended by that at all. It's so hard to pick out memories, but one stands out from a holiday John, my husband, and I shared with Jill and Pete in their flat in Madeira. As you can imagine, they were both wonderful hosts. We ate out each evening, all great meals, but Pete kept referring to a particular restaurant he wanted to go to for his favourite Madeiran dish. This got a rather resigned reaction from Jill, and I couldn't understand why. We finally got to the restaurant at the end of the holiday, where Pete ordered a dish called espadadas. When it arrived, it was found to be a huge beef skewer hanging on a metal frame that took up most of the table. With a twinkle in his eye, Pete ate the whole meat fest, watched over with wry amusement by Jill, a lifelong vegetarian. So that's Pete in my memory, a lovely man who really enjoyed life to the full and who made my sister very happy. They made a truly amazing couple. And now I'd like to pass you across to Janet George, who was Pete's stepmother-in-law.
If my memory serves me right, my husband, Jill's dad, and I first met Pete in a Stoke Newington pub in December 2000. We understood we were about to be introduced to somebody really important in Jill's life and were full of anticipation and trepidation. We really wanted this person to be right for Jill. We needn't have worried. As soon as we saw them together, we realised that Pete was the partner Jill had been waiting for. They seemed so happy together and struck sparks off each other in a way that was really lovely to see. Of course, the conversation veered towards the political. Not that Pete ever took it in a direction we couldn't follow, because we were at a critical time, waiting for a decision on who was to be US president. So much depended on what happened because it was going to be either George W. Bush or Al Gore. It should have been Gore, and world history would almost certainly have taken a different path. But political chicanery meant we ended up with George W. Pete, having lived in the States, knew a great deal about American politics and had followed the cliffhanging progress of the recounts. It was fascinating to hear what he had to say. All in all, it was a highly enjoyable first meeting. In the years that followed, we realised that Jill's game was also our game. The growth of the family is an interesting phenomenon as each new partner or child is added to the mix. Pete was a terrific addition, always there with Jill on family occasions, generous with his attention, getting on with everyone and interested in everyone. After Jill's dad died at the end of 2009, we decided that if possible, the combined family, by now quite large, would meet once a year on a date near his birthday to be together to remember him. Pete always came to this event, even if it meant arriving late because of an important meeting, and it was so good to have him with us. Jill and Pete always spent Christmas with us in London. They were both good at Christmas, making it fun with silly games and great presents. They would arrive with seemingly bottomless bags of goodies. The Ludlow Christmas cheese was always a highlight, and later on, really good Madeira. You will all know what an immensely generous person Pete was. I and other members of the family spent many happy times at the Ludlow house, which with its huge spaces seemed just right for Pete. No demands were made on one. You could relax and do whatever took your fancy, but part of the day would usually be spent in the pub across the road, chatting with Pete and Jill's many friends and neighbours. Pete had such enthusiasm and such enjoyment of life. Little things gave him great pleasure, even while he was involved with the really big, important things. We'll miss him very much. And now I'd like to pass over to my daughter, Rachel.
This is also on behalf of my brothers, Matt and Ben. For those that don't know, my mum and Jill's dad married nearly 40 years ago, each having 3 children from their first marriage. We've been an extended family ever since. Pete became the tallest member of this extended family at the beginning of the 2000s. It was a lovely surprise when Jill first brought Pete to a family event. Joining a family might be unnerving for some, but Pete's easygoing nature meant that he just seemed to fit in straight away. Jill and Pete made a brilliant couple. There was never any question of his love and support for her. Their shared passion for politics was the backdrop against which Pete's extraordinary respect and pride in Jill showed itself. I won't forget Pete delighting in telling me how Jill had literally left her hospital bed to address striking hospital workers, monitor leads still dangling from her pocket. As Mum said, Pete always took an interest in people and the details of their lives. As he'd lived and worked in the States, he was always interested in talking to my brother's partner, Jen, who is American, showing a genuine interest in her experiences, not in any judgmental or analytical way, just sharing reminiscences. Pete wasn't just interested in people, he was interested in everything. Anne mentioned his love of gadgetry and apps, but Pete also liked facts and finding information. I remember saying that I'd always wanted to know about it's just some silly geographical thing. And I wasn't remotely surprised when he texted me the answer the next day. Pete was a book lover in a big way. My brother Matt and I remember being shown into the basement of the house in Stoke Newington. It was like a public library, stacked floor to ceiling with books. Very thoughtful and generous gifts, often involved books. He and Jill once gave Ben a book they'd found in a second-hand bookshop, which had been given as a prize in 1902 to a pupil at one of the schools that my brother looks after. The house in Ludlow was always interesting to visit, so big that Jill and Pete would phone each other to find out where each of them was. We once all spent a Christmas there. Pete displayed an unexpected talent for making ice cream, pear and ginger, I think. Whenever we met, Pete was fantastic company. Generous, warm and kind. I know that for most of you, Pete was a fabulous friend and tireless activist. But for us, he was part of our family and we'll miss him enormously.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'd like to call now our next speaker, who is Sylvia Jones. Sylvia is a rural health campaigner who worked with Pete and Jill in Shropshire to defend our NHS. Sylvia.
Well, I am a very recent friend of Pete and Jill's, drawn from that broad coalition that they built up to great effect and for the benefit of all the patients of the people in Shropshire. To all intents and purposes, Pete looked to me like the complete urban man. I could imagine him being perfectly at home in a smoky little room, trying to hammer out a complicated composite resolution for a union conference, leading a campaign march, or the standout person on a picket line with the placard held inevitably just a bit higher than any of the others. But there he was, walking up Corb Street in sleepy little Ludlow with Jill. Him up there, her down there. An unusual looking couple, but as I later found out, the perfect fit for taking on and exposing probably the worst set of NHS bosses in the country. They were the founding members of the highly successful Shropshire Defend Our NHS campaign group, which later incorporated Telford and Wrekin. Their combined strength was formidable, and they used it well, delaying by a good 5 years a deeply flawed hospital reorganisation scheme, incongruously named Future Fit, and thereby, I believe, saving the lives of many patients. Revolutionary urban politics may have been his hothouse, but Pete adapted his particular innate intelligence to the rising tide of inequalities of life in the beautiful, but in many ways deprived parts of rural Shropshire. His ability to cut through the doublespeak, to analyse the data and highlight the potentially devastating consequences for patients was outstanding. This made him an awkward warrior at CCG and Trust Board meetings, where he was always way ahead of those people paid high salaries to come up with the right plans for patients. It didn't make him a welcome audience guest, but then Pete wasn't there to win a popularity poll. He didn't mind if he made the bureaucrats from the NHS squirm. He knew he was doing the right thing for Shropshire. He was insightful and surgical in the way he did it. It was great to go to NHS meetings with him. He was always so well prepared, and most importantly, had read all the papers, something I often thought board members had failed to do as they waffled through questions from the public, and Pete in particular. Pete knew what had to be done, and he worked hard. He was a man of great integrity. Campaigning to save the vital community hospitals like Ludlow, or battling to get safe rural maternity care in a county with an ongoing investigation into the deaths and injury of more than 1,000 babies going back decades. Or out of hours medical services as basic as pain relief for the terminally ill dying at home. Mental health and social care in remote areas where the current popular slogan, home is best, can quickly turn into home is prison if the slash and burn cuts policy of recent years continues for much longer. These are some of the issues close to Pete's heart, and I and many others will miss his incisive intellect, his hard work, and his steadfast integrity about the things that really matter. And people really mattered to Pete, whether they lived in the city or the countryside. And in Shropshire, I watched him work to improve the quality of life and death of many. So he may not, after all, have been just an urban rebel at the thin end of the red wedge. But I never quite got used to having a three-way conversation with him. Me, Pete, and Alexa, who often didn't do as she was supposed to. Even though hearing him talking to a disobedient machine made him seem more like me, a 70-odd-something-year-old struggling with new technology. Goodbye, Pete. Alexa and me will not be the only ones who will miss you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I'd now like to call on Pete's comrade and friend, Rachel Ebrell, to make a brief announcement.
Some of Pete's friends and comrades have been asking us a case to which they can donate in Pete's memory. We've already heard that Pete dedicated much of the last few years defending the NHS from both cuts and privatisation. He became a national figure fighting the Tories' attempts to destroy the NHS. However, for all his political life, Pete was shaped and defined through his commitment to internationalism. Pete would have understood that although COVID-19 was born of nature, the fact that it had become a disaster of epic proportions is nothing natural, but highly political. Just as the struggle for a better world is an international struggle, the fight against this virus is also international. This pandemic has shown how dysfunctional capitalism is as a global system. And all over the world, we've seen health workers and patients being sacrificed. The future of the system the failure of the system has been particularly stark in Pakistan, where doctors and nurses have been totally failed by their government and have been asked to put their life in danger due to inadequate PPE. Health workers in Pakistan haven't taken this line down. However, they've been protesting for adequate PPE so they can look after themselves and their families, but also provide adequate care for their patients. After these protests, they've been beaten, tortured. So we're therefore asking people to donate to a grassroots organisation called Friends of Doctors. It's a new grassroots organisation in Pakistan who are making and distributing PPE to medical workers. Details of how to donate have been posted in the Facebook around this event and will be sent to all attendees. But it's important to say that donating to this organisation isn't an act of charity, but it's an act of solidarity.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. We're going to have another piece of music now. This is one of Pete's favourite songs, The Blackleg Miner. And although Pete was a very gentle man, Jill tells me he particularly loved the bit about breaking the blackleg's spine. So, The Blackleg Miner.
It's in the evening after dark, when the blackleg miner creeps to work, with his moleskin pants and dirty shirt. There goes the blackleg miner. Well, he grabs his duds and down he goes to hew the coal that lies below. There's not a woman in this town row will look at the blackleg miner. I rub wet clay in the blackleg's face, and around the heaps I run a foot race to catch the blackleg miner. And if I'm gang near the Seggle mine, across the way they stretch a line to catch the throat and break the spine of the dirty blackleg miner. Picks us all and they hide them down the prison hole. Down you go, where you while you dirty blackleg miner. So it's in the evening after dark that the blackleg miner creeps to work with his moleskin pants and dirty shirt. There goes the blackleg miner. Don't join the union for your money, don't wait till you're dying, or that may not be far away. Yeah, dirty blackleg miner.
The Blackleg Miner. Pete was an internationalist, first and foremost, not just in theory, but in practice. And it didn't matter where he was in the world, Pete threw himself into the political activity, regardless of how familiar he was with the country he was in, or how long he'd been there. As a revolutionary socialist who joined the International Socialists in the Netherlands, at the same time as our next speaker, Miriam Ora, joined the group at that point, and they were active together in Holland at the time. So I call on Miriam. Thank you, Miriam.
Yes, hi, do you hear me? Yes, hi, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to say something. And I want to start by my sympathies for Pete's family, comrade, partner, of course. It's such a huge loss. And yeah, I think about him a lot, but I don't want to make this about my own memories and anecdotes, which I have many to share. I don't want to make this about me, but I want to share this space a moment with the numerous Dutch comrades, because if anyone would do a dissection or a deconstruction of the IS in the Netherlands, they would maybe find in Pete a very lovely piece of the IS Netherlands puzzle from the period roughly 1997 to 2000. That's when he stood with a group of revolutionary socialists, very young revolutionary socialists, as the organization was making a leap and tripled in membership at the time. I'm not saying this because it couldn't have been possible without Pete, and I think Pete would be the first one to say that. But I'm saying this because his presence surely played a fun whilst very serious role in that early process. So I asked comrades who remember him and grew up with him almost literally, and who miss him dearly, that I know from the conversations I've been having in the last few days, collecting these memories. So I've asked them to share some of their memories, which I don't want to withhold from you. Some of the descriptive words that have passed through these different treasure troves that I've collected are the following: healthy optimism, dedication, generous, humble, not arrogant, knowledgeable, experienced, and also weird humor. So when I say a piece of the puzzle, I actually mean a very sharp, stubbornly shaped, weirdly edged piece of the puzzle. And his presence was marked by a weirdly original humor that you only get to really understand after a while, and that people maybe in the beginning not really get or think that he's just being silly. So I want to give you the anecdotes related to these different descriptive words that have been shared, that I picked out from the narratives. Dedication. The dedication of Pete was really on all levels. The stories that have been shared with me are ranging from Pete selling the paper, not knowing a word of Dutch, and just making eye contact and then passing on any person who stops for a chat to someone else. This was a memory that Hans related to me, that he would get basically the people that Pete would pass on to him. And always mispronouncing Dutch words and names, which was a memory that Bart shared with me when he would go and visit Pete in the Noorderstraat, and no one would understand what he was saying. His dedication was sometimes very well-meaning, but not always practical. So another memory of Hans was going around his place, knocking on Pete's door, and then Pete hastily opening up and telling him, wait, just a moment. I'm trying to get a fist in the circle. He was trying to help the group make a flyer, not understanding actually that this group in the Netherlands would turn out to be one of the best designers of the IS tendency at that time. The other word that came up was generous, sweet kindness. Peyman shared a memory with me. Peyman, who was at the time, I think around 1997, 98, the organizer of Amsterdam. And he had the idea to organize a meeting called May 68, the fire last time. And he said, well, he looked old enough to do that meeting. And he said, we were all so impressed by Pete's talk at the University of Amsterdam in a small room. But Peyman then added, I was also personally very impressed, remembering the number of pints Pete was actually managing to digest afterwards in the pub. The other word was knowledgeable, a memory from Mina. Literally, he remembers, like many of us, of course, remembering the generosity and hospitality of Pete when we would come to London, and his house was our house. And staying with him often meant the spare bedroom in the basement. And Mina remembers being extremely impressed by all the bookshelves that were in the basement, the amount of books and the kind of books. And he says it literally was impressive. It was like walking in a library because there were so many shelves and you could walk through them and behind and next to them. The other term, healthy optimism. Pepijn remembers Pete on a business trip passing through Amsterdam, and he remembers Pete calling him to say, come, we need to have a chat. So just come to the hotel lobby where I'm staying. And Pete invited Pepijn, and Pepijn says to me, I had never been inside such an impressive, expensive hotel. I was looking my eyes out, but actually Pete wanted to provoke him. He asked Pepijn, have you watched CNN in the past few days at all? And Pepijn was like, no, not really. And this was late 99. He was referring to a city called Seattle. And the rest is history, as you will know. The last thing that came up a lot was humor. Much of what Pete brought was with brutal honesty, wrapped in very dry humor and very uncompromising. This memory from Michiel. He remembers what is now a classic story in the IS, a scene at a meeting where many of the non-recruits at the time were actually from the straight edge underground hardcore scene. So many were vegetarians. So there was a meeting and a heated discussion about Marxism and vegetarianism. And some of the members sharply disagreed with Pete. And they were very dedicated. And then someone asked, but what about the dolphins? What about the dolphins? And then Pete said in his style, yes, well, they taste very good. So he was very brutal, but like Michiel said, brutal just as we loved it. So I just want to end up by saying that his mocking humor was not just a fun game. It had a clearly pedagogical purpose. Firstly, self-reflection. What am I really assuming here? And secondly, unpretentiousness, not taking yourself too serious. You are not the measure. So I want to end by saying that this turned out to be a recurring characteristic of Pete. From the very start, he was pushing us to be more outward and outgoing, whether it meant working with other people and other groups outside our own organization or developing our own ideas, and to be less dogmatically reliant on the central committee. So he was the embodiment of the paradox of capital and principle, because we all know the stories of his function in the business world. And the last story was from Hans. He met him on the subway on the east side of Amsterdam once, and Hans happily approached Pete to have a chat with him. And then Pete, being so big, stood in front of Hans and basically rendered him invisible. And there was a group of men in business suits behind Pete. And then Pete says to Hans, who's already invisible by then, please pretend you don't know me.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you. When I asked our next speaker how she wanted to be introduced, she said simply a friend and comrade of Pete's. She was definitely both. Shanice Matbean.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for asking me to speak. I feel really grateful that Jill asked me to speak today. And obviously, like everyone, I was like totally gutted when I heard of Pete's passing. And, you know, we all know the figures in the UK at the moment for people passing from coronavirus are upwards of 30,000, and that's heartbreaking, and it's really sucks. But when it's that one person who you really admire, that hurts differently. And I definitely held a lot and do hold a lot of admiration for Pete. And it's come up in conversation a few times with different people that I lost a friend to the virus. And describing Pete, a couple of times people have said, oh, what, you've got a 70-year-old mate in Shropshire, old friend in Shropshire. Like, how is this person your friend? How do you know this person? And what brought you together? And I think that question of what brings people of different races, different genders, different sexualities, ages, abilities, cultures, religions, how you bring these different groups together is more important now in the current climate, in the current context, than it feels it's been in a long time, but also at the same time feels less possible to make happen. We feel more divided. So I want to talk a little bit about how me and Pete became friends. So we met in the Socialist Workers' Party about 8 years ago at this point. And that's where we met, but ultimately we bonded and became friends around the split from the SWP when we moved away from the party and the organisation. And we moved away from it and we bonded on the principle of fighting against women's oppression. And ultimately the reason why we became friends is because Pete stood with women. He stood against oppression. He stood up for people that look like me. He stood up for me. And in doing that, he stood up for our class as a whole. And that's why Pete and I were friends. It wasn't always an easy friendship, I have to say. I have a partner also called Jill with a G, and we have always been quite jealous of the fact that Pete and Jill are by far much better activists than we have ever been. We visited their house in Madeira several times, and while we were on holiday, Pete and Jill, the times that they were there, were always working on various NHS-related work that they were doing. So I think that just shows you their level of commitment and dedication. And of course, both having partners called Jill made conversations quite confusing at times, but nevertheless, it was always in good fun. And we've also had our own interesting interactions with Pete's Alexa in Madeira as well, but those are stories for another time. But I guess to kind of finish up, I guess, you know, Pete, and people have spoken about how amazing he is, but Pete was able to build friendships across so many different barriers and boundaries. He built friendships with me. You know, we're 40 years apart and probably lots of cultural references and slang words apart as well. And yet we were still able to have that friendship. So I guess something to take away is for us all to walk in the footsteps of Pete and Jill, invite people into your home, build those friendships, fight for what you believe in, fight for the NHS, and ultimately fight for our class. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Shanice. Thank you. We're going to have some more music now. Pete knew which side he was on. His political commitment wasn't an accident. It was part of his DNA, completely part of who he was. And this is an absolutely classic song. Pete always liked to sing this song, and it's one that he and Jill used to sing on country walks with improvisations around the jobs of their parents as required. The song will be accompanied by a slideshow, which we hope you'll enjoy. The song is Which Side Are You On?
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? They say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there. You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair. Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? My daddy was a miner, and I'm a miner's son. He'll be with you, fellow workers, until this battle's won. Tell me, which side are you on? Which side are you on? Sing it! Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Oh, workers, can you stand it? Tell me how you can. Will you be a lousy scab, or will you be a man? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Tell me, which side are you on? Which side Come all of you good workers, good news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the slideshow. And on the third shot in, I wonder if you spotted which one Pete was. A very young Pete standing, holding a placard about the Vietnam War, I believe. Our next speaker is Ian Allenson, who was an activist alongside Pete in their union from when it was MSF through to Amicus through to Unite, and served on the union's executive council for 10 years, and is now an organizer for RS21, an organizer of which Pete was a very active member. Ian.
As we've heard, Pete didn't take a narrow view of what constitutes class struggle, but he did see the workplace as a particularly important site of struggle, from being a shop steward at Oxford University Press to organising support workers at the Metropolitan Police, of all places, and building solidarity for countless campaigns and disputes. Pete's priority was always workers' self-activity, mass activity wherever possible, emphasising the importance of winning rather than gestures. One of Pete's roles was often to puncture groupthink. He played a sobering role against wishful thinking, people mistaking positive exceptions for a general pattern. Yet he sustained activism over a lifetime despite, or perhaps because of, this pessimism of the intellect. One example of this was his insistence on the difficulties of the rank and file exercising control in a general union like Unite. Rank and file power comes from workers' ability to resist employers without reliance on full-time officials. Rank and file networks grow from solidarity around struggles with employers. And outside peaks of struggle, it's unusual for workers in different sectors to be in major conflicts at the same time. So officials in a general union are particularly well placed to balance between an active minority in a sector in struggle and a passive majority maintaining their control. Now, a rank and file orientation doesn't mean ignoring union structures and policies, but thinking about how they can be used to build the organisation and combativity of the rank and file. Pete encouraged comrades to get involved in wider left organisation in MSF, as our union was then, and build networks and influence. He opposed the two main union mergers because of their threat to democratic member rights in MSF and then the Transport and General Workers Union. But once the mergers were agreed, Pete pushed to rapidly merge the left groupings within the merging unions. Pete involved MSF members in the campaign to unseat AWU General Secretary Sir Ken Jackson, Blair's favourite trade unionist, with at the very least indirect links to the CIA. Jackson was beaten by just 406 votes, breaking the hold of the Labour right over the AWU and Amicus. This engagement with the wider union left also saw Jill, Jerry Hicks, Colin Walker and myself elected to the Amicus National Executive. Pete was insistent that our role was about impact outside the room, not reactions inside it. And this was vital support when Jill was consistently bullied by Amicus General Secretary Derek Simpson, or when we were expelled from the left for refusing to repudiate locked out construction workers who were building Wembley Stadium. Pete was very committed to being part of a wider left, but not at any price. A rank and file approach also means democracy and participation are crucial. Bureaucracies use rules and procedures to prevent newly active or less educated members taking part or exercising influence, but they can also enshrine rights and protections for members. Pete always learned the rules, as we've heard, and helped other activists to navigate them. So he saw his role when he was chair of Unite's Standing Orders Committee, which decides how the union's conferences are run, as enabling delegates to take the decisions they wanted, resisting attempts to manipulate the process from above. I think the conferences while he was in office saw fewer point of order challenges raised by delegates than at any other time. This is just one example of Pete's wider contribution in supporting other activists, drawing on his huge knowledge. He'd gained some of it firsthand, but a lot of it from reading. As we've heard, he had a vast collection of books, pamphlets and documents from which he seemed able to pluck out something relevant, despite it giving the appearance of disorganised heaps a lot of the time. I often used to stay with Pete and Jill when at union and political meetings in London, eating and drinking out late, and dosed up with antihistamines in the hope I could delay my allergy to their much-loved cats until I left in the morning. Since Pete and Jill moved to Ludlow, I saw them face-to-face less frequently, as for some reason my allergy was worse there, but me and Isabel were able to holiday with them in Madeira a couple of times. Pete played a part in setting up RS21, the new socialist group that emerged from the wreckage of the SWP, and his long experience in the revolutionary left, including developing tiny groups into something more, made him more realistic than most about the difficulties we would face. But this motivated patient effort, not despair. Pete's questioning approach often enriched many discussions on RS21's national steering group, whether you agreed with him or not. Pete's kindness and generosity, comradeship and friendship enabled fierce and frequent arguments. Like so many others, I learned a huge amount from him. It's no coincidence that the word mentor has kept popping up in people's memories of Pete. We'll all miss Pete terribly, but we know that he had a huge impact on events, on organisations, and on a lot of people.
Thank you very much, Ian. Pete's life was always anchored by his politics, but also by the great love he shared with his partner and then wife, Jill George. As someone who had known him for years, it was easy to see the joy Jill brought to his life, the loving bond that existed between them, and the joyful way in which they shared their common struggles to defend our rights and make a better world. It's an absolute honour to call on Jill now to speak.
Thank you. People in our street called Pete the big friendly giant. And you know, Pete was so big, so invincible, it's incredibly hard to believe that he's gone. And Pete was my partner for 20 years, almost exactly. We met in the year 2000 at the union's National Policy Conference. The union then was MSF. And the left was hanging out in the bar the night before conference began, and this strange tall man kind of appeared and loomed over me, and he asked me to look at his petition. And this might have been a lefty chat-up line, I'm not quite sure, but I looked at the petition, and it was politically absolutely fine, but it was really badly worded. So I told him that, and then I said I was very tired, and I said good night, and I went to bed. And I've no idea why, but Pete obviously thought this was the basis for a long-term relationship. So he actually rang me a week or two later. You've heard about his business trips. He rang me from San Francisco, and he was there for work. But what he told me about, this was on a Saturday, what he told me about was a trade union demonstration that he'd just been on. And it was a protest by dockers, by people called longshoremen, and some longshore women as well. And they carried these amazing kind of sharp curved hooks when they marched. And that was cool. I mean, trade unionists marching with offensive weapons. And I was very, very impressed by that. And that was the basis on which we agreed that we should go out for a drink sometime. So, you know, you then roll on a few weeks. We went out actually for a vegetarian meal, and that didn't happen again for a very long time. After that, we went on for a drink. We were both being very, very polite. We both said, well, that was very nice. We must do this again sometime. It was a Friday night. The weekend would have been much too soon, much too keen. So the conversation kind of went along the lines of, oh, well, can't do Monday, district committee. Tuesday, union branch. Wednesday, yeah, trades council. Thursday, SWP, yeah, same for me. So we ended up agreeing that we'd have to meet a week later. But in that little scrap of conversation, there were two things that were very, very important to me. And one was that our lives were plainly woven of the same fabric. The other is that Pete, not that evening nor at any other time, Pete never ever suggested that what I did politically was unimportant and it could be dropped to accommodate his needs. And on that evening, 20 years ago, that was more important to me than anything else. So we moved in together. We were joined by a succession of charming cats. We did a pile of political work. We had some smashing holidays. Pete got his job with the Met Police, and he was initially as angry as hell that he passed his security clearance. He was furious. We then retired from paid work, though obviously not from politics, and we moved to Ludlow, an absolutely beautiful town in Shropshire. And life was pretty good for 2 decades. Life was pretty good until Pete's illness very sharply intervened. I want to go back in time just quickly to Pete's early life because it influenced him a lot. Pete was a working class kid from Bristol. He grew up in a prefab, one of those post-war prefabs. His dad had an admin job at the bus company, and his absolutely wonderful mum was an Irish immigrant who came to this country to train as a nurse. Pete did not learn Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star at his mother's knee. He learnt an Irish rebel song called Kevin Barry, the lad of 18 summers executed by the Brits in 1920. And Pete's mother, Kay, she experienced anti-Irish racism firsthand when she came to Britain, and her own mother, Pete's grandma, had been brutally beaten by the Black and Tans again in 1920. And you look at that and you think, yeah, it's obvious where Pete got his hatred of racism and his contempt for British imperialism. But then along came Bristol Cathedral School, and Pete was a very bright lad, and he was the only kid in his school to pass the 11 plus and go on to grammar school. But his mom wanted the very, very best for him. So Pete got one of the very few state-funded places at the extremely posh Bristol Cathedral School. And Pete actually always credited his school days with making him a socialist. Think about that classic bit of homework. What did you do on your holidays? The other kids, they'd write about France or Italy, whereas Pete would write about the week in the boarding house in Weston-super-Mare. A different experience, a different life. And Pete remembered with huge bitterness the teachers who picked on him or humiliated him in public. And something terribly important to him, he was so angry about this. Pete was robbed of the maths prize that should have been his by right, and the prize was given to a posh kid instead. And, you know, if a posh kid getting your maths prize doesn't make you a socialist, I don't know what the hell does. But by the age of 16, the young Pete had read and thought and applied impeccable logic, and he became a revolutionary socialist. And that decision set the course for the rest of his life. And Pete had unwavering commitment to fighting for change, for helping to create a world fit for humanity. He was a Marxist from the age of 16 right through to when he died at 70. I mean, we've heard Pete took his politics very, very seriously. And yeah, sure, he enjoyed a political argument. Pete would argue for fun, but he was also aware, always aware, that politics wasn't a game. The purpose of being a political activist for Pete, the purpose was always to win, to change things for the better. And Pete was also fiercely principled. His politics were not ever about unthinking an automatic loyalty to an organisation. He was much more thoughtful, much more principled than that. And we heard a little bit from Shanice about that break with the Socialist Workers' Party. And, you know, that's a very, very big deal when you've spent decades of your life in a political organisation. And I still remember so clearly, I found out in a phone call what was going on, some very, very serious stuff about rape, about the cover-up stuff that I hadn't known, Pete hadn't known, and I walked through to the next room to tell Pete. And if he had been on the wrong side of that fight, I could not have stayed with Pete. But Pete immediately shared my horror and my anger. Of course he did, because Pete's politics told him you cannot have socialism without women's liberation. And that mattered much more than any organisational loyalty. Absolutely rightly. And that theme of principled choices, never ducking hard arguments when they were needed, that was something that genuinely characterised Pete's political work right the way through. But, and we've heard about this from other people, Pete combined that with that instinct for unity, for finding common ground and working together. And I think the best example of that is that Pete died in Ludlow Community Hospital, and that's the hospital that we fought to keep open in 2017. A brilliant, united mass campaign, and a campaign that won. And you know, you cannot build a huge fight to stop hospital closure by going up to people in Ludlow and saying, well, how did you vote then? Don't think I want to work with you. Absolutely not. You find common ground and you work together. And again, this is something that Pete understood and made real in how he worked. Pete, of course, was very bright, very agile. He enjoyed meetings. He loved terms of reference. It drove me spare that he kept stealing my union rule book when I needed it. And it was actually quite extraordinary that he reinvented himself as a local and national NHS campaigner, dealing with huge complexity in his final few years of life. And Pete always did the detail, and actually the detail is part of what delivers victory. And, you know, some more personal stuff. Pete was also a bit of a sweetheart. He loved cats. He talked to cats. Cats felt very safe with him. Pete's favourite, best ever cat was Ben, the big, handsome grey cat who was in one of the photos earlier. And Pete had this party trick. It was horrible, this party trick where he and Ben would share a digestive biscuit, nibbling it from opposite sides until they met in the middle. And I would watch and say, for God's sake, Pete, that is disgusting. But he couldn't be dissuaded. Pete liked ducks. He liked the seaside. He played Candy Crush too much. He sang songs very, very badly. He talked to random animals on country walks. Very, very recently, he saw a goat. He was in quite an exuberant mood and he bellowed, "Hello, goatie!" failing to notice the woman just behind on the footpath who creased up with laughter. And, you know, Pete was tremendously sweet and kind and generous. And when you could prise him away from his mobile phone, he was very good company. And I'm going to miss him like mad. If I had to sum it up, I'd say that Pete was one of the good guys. He didn't just dream of a better world. He spent the whole of his life fighting to make it happen. And in the midst of this terrible COVID crisis, my God, it is so obvious. We need socialism. We need a system that prioritises solidarity, internationalism, human life. We need more class fighters to get us there. Pete was my comrade, my partner, my friend. I loved him. Rest in power, Pete Gillard.
Thank you very, very much, Jill. That was wonderful. We're going to do now the thing I'm sure Pete would expect us to do. Although you're all muted, we're about to have the Internationale, and I invite you, while muted, to sing it at home, maybe confuse and muddle your neighbours as to what exactly is going on, but do feel free to join in and sing the Internationale. Thank you.
All right.
coming from the slumbers, arise, ye risen of the want, for reasoning upon others, and at last ends the age of cant. So away with all your superstitions, so the masses arise, arise, we'll change completely on conditions, and spurn the dust to win the prize. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race.
Thank you very much, everyone. Hopefully there are a lot of puzzled neighbours at this point. We now have an open mic. There is a two-minute limit, time limit to each speaker. Please stay within it. There's only a limited amount of time, so if you exceed your time, other people won't get to speak. Also, if you exceed your time, the timer may well mute you anyway, so it's always better to draw your remarks to a conclusion. Ask to speak by either typing in the chat box, or if you can use the raise hands function in Zoom, then feel free to do that. Okay, thank you. I'm just waiting for the first speaker to indicate. The first speaker is Charlie Hoare, and Charlie will be followed by Max. If somebody can unmute Charlie, or
yes, I'm unmuting myself, I think. Thanks, Pat. I first met Pete as a very new IS member in October 1974, and we lost sight of each other for a while after he moved to London, and then he moved to New York, and we reconnected when he came back from New York to Marxism. And my first real memory of that is this would be about 1985, 1986. We sort of sat down together talking about what his job in New York, my job in. By that point, I'd moved to London. I was working for Bookmarks, and we eventually worked out that Pete was paying more in subs to the ISO than I was earning working for Bookmarks. And I say that because one of the things that people haven't talked about is Pete's work, what he actually did. And I'm not about to enlighten you, because every time we discussed it, he lost me very, very quickly indeed. Very, very quickly indeed. I had no idea what any of this stuff. But the one thing he was at pains to emphasize was he was never a manager. And that's important, because the reality is that given what Pete knew about computing and Pete's ability to talk to people, to persuade, Pete could have worked his way very high up the corporate ladder into a whole different. He didn't. And this actually involved consciously refusing to take management positions, consciously turning down promotions, consciously staying at a point where he was, he was increasingly, as he got older, he was less hands-on, he was more systems, but nevertheless, he was keeping away from management, and he was keeping himself as part of as someone who was very much not part of management, and that was critically important. A number of comrades have talked about Pete as a mentor and educationist.
Bring your remarks to a close, thanks.
I will do. Very quickly, Pete's Pete wasn't trying to tell you how much he knew. Pete was trying to get you to learn what you could do, and that was Pete's gift. Whether it was in Britain, whether it was in the Netherlands, where he was, I think, happier than at any time, or whether it was in the States. Pete wanted us to learn how to be better, how to be a better socialist, how to be better activists, and that's the legacy. He was, I think, the most important formative experience of my life, and I'll always treasure that.
Thanks very much. Now we've got Max, and Max will be followed by Colin Wilson.
Sure. It's been such a lovely sequence of comments and speakers. I guess I just wanted to reiterate something that came across a bit in Shanice's talk earlier, which is that although obviously Pete was 70 or 70 thereabouts when he died, so many of the people who've spoken were, you know, older comrades or middle-aged comrades. So many of the younger people who knew him as well found he served that sort of generational link that Sherry mentioned in her, and, you know, did that right up till the end, and really was such a kind of model of resilience, and someone who'd been in the struggle for a long time at a time when there were very slim pickings for morale and motivation, but who would never gave up, would never have given up. And I think in Charlie Hoare's very wonderful obituary, there's such a few moments, you know, the younger Pete is in some ways a very different Pete. Pete in 1969 making the principled argument about British imperialism to a furious and potentially violent student union crowd just after the Birmingham bombings, or Pete in 1977 breaking the police lines and having a polite conversation with the National Front at the Battle of Lewisham. But it's the same person still. I very much recognise who you could find in his later years campaigning against the racism of the Home Office, or, you know, building that improbable coalition that Jill and others referred to in Shropshire, and that has really been an inspiration to so many of us. So yeah, I'll draw it to a close there.
Thank you very much, Max. Next speaker is Colin Wilson, and Colin will be followed by Hannah Basson. I'll try to give you 30 seconds warning if you do come near the end. Okay, Colin.
Thanks. I'm speaking on behalf of Brian Parkin from Leeds, a long-standing comrade of Pete's, and sadly Brian can't attend today because of illness, but he wanted a memory read out. And it's about the mid-1970s, when the openly fascist National Front was making huge gains in England. They were posturing as respectable to win votes, but vicious racist attacks were part and parcel of how they grew. And quite rightly, anti-racists organised to stop them, and one demo in 1977 was decisive in driving them back. So that's the context, and Brian wrote as follows. In 1977, there was a particular and very violent, but nonetheless decisive, confrontation with the National Front and the London Metropolitan Police at Lewisham. On arriving at the chaotic scene at New Cross Lewisham that fateful day, I saw the tall figure of Pete at the front of what was becoming a huge crowd. I recall saying hello and realising that Pete was very far from his usual chatty self. I remember saying something like, I hope this will prove to be a decisive event. We were by then sick of being battered black and blue from endless anti-fascist demos, to which Pete replied, oh, believe me it will. Later, and almost on cue, after repeated police horse charges and foot officer charges to vainly but violently shove us back, the head of the NF march, surrounded by hundreds of police officers, came into view. Then smoke flares from our side were thrown, followed by bricks, drink cans full of piss, in fact anything at hand. And then a loud hailer order, and then a repeated grunting chant as a flying wedge of about 200 on our side, Pete Gillard's head showing at the front, seemingly suicidally drove through the side of the police escort and straight into the honour guard and the NF leadership scum they were protecting. Then mayhem, with scattering, bleeding and screaming for mercy representatives of the master race running for their lives, pursued by hordes of take-no-quarter anti-fascists, followed by hand-to-hand fighting with remnant Nazis and police for over 3 hours. I recall meeting up with Pete sometime afterwards, as we were besieged in the grounds of Goldsmiths College, and still throwing stones at the police, who by then were using snatch squads to make quite extensive arrests. This is when I got an insight into what was that day a conflicted and reflective personality. "I hate violence," he said, "but that was fucking brilliant."
Thank you, Colin. And the next speaker is Hannah Basson, followed by Terry Conway.
Oh, hi. I'm using my Unite mug at the moment, Jill. Unite was my 3rd union since joining the NHS, and when my colleagues and I were threatened with privatisation, a mutual friend, Caroline Malloy, advised me to talk to Pete and Jill, and I knew I'd found my union home then. Stroud against the cuts and keep Gloucestershire's NHS public were deeply saddened to learn of Pete's passing, of course, and we will always remember Pete for his integrity and for his intelligence and his knowledge, endless knowledge on the NHS. He imparted this knowledge in such a way that even those new to campaigning could understand easily. Each time he spoke in Stroud, including coming on his birthday for our NHS 70th anniversary celebration, a number of people commented how his was the talk that spoke most to them, and that he left them with a really good understanding of the current situation. He was able to speak to people of all political views on any subject, showing an authority that enabled our cause to be heard by people we couldn't always reach out to. And he stressed always the importance of winning, no matter how small the win. And this was very important to us at times when it felt as though every fight was being superseded by yet another fight. Rest in power and in peace, Pete.
Thank you very much, Hannah. The next speaker is Terry Conway, and Terry will be followed by Nicola Redwood.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks, comrades. I feel very privileged to have been at this meeting celebrating Pete's life, and to see so many of you that I've not seen for a long time and some of you that I don't know. I wanted to share some small memories of Pete, which I concur with what other speakers have said. I met Pete in the dying days of MSF, when we were both members of the housing workers branch of that union. We used to meet in the boardroom of the Housing Corporation building, Euston Road. And Pete was, as he always was, working in computers, and most people in the branch were workers on the front line, directly dealing with clients. But the fact that Pete's work was very different from the majority of people in the room, and that it was a difficult branch to organise. We were cross London, few activists in many workplaces. Didn't stop being able to listen to the stories that people brought of how they were trying to organise in their workplaces, the issues of conditions, the issues of management bullying that people were facing. And as many people have said, Pete's attention to detail, but also I think his ability to put himself in the position of other activists and give you advice without you ever feeling that he was talking down to you was something that I've rarely met in nearly 50 years of political activism. I just wanted to conclude by saying that I will miss Pete enormously, and that my heart goes out to all the other comrades for whom that's true, and particularly to Jill.
Thank you very much, Terry. I'd now like to call Nicola Redwood, followed by Lee Sustar.
Thanks, Pat. I think it was
probably 1998 when I first joined something called the IT Professionals Association, and found myself in a trade union called MSF, Manufacturing Science Finance. And I went along to branch meetings regularly, and very shortly after that met Pete, and he came across as somebody who was knowledgeable, experienced, but also, as Terry has just said, he never talked down to anybody. He was completely inclusive of everybody. And even if he disagreed with you on something in an argument, and Jill was absolutely right, he could argue the hind legs off a donkey, he still found a way of encouraging you to make your point, even if you didn't agree with that point. I remember a very heated debate we had about nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and so there were some disagreements in the room, and I was like, well, nuclear energy is cleaner than fossil fuels, and everybody was, but nuclear energy is so bad. And I was like, everybody kind of looked to me. I'd made this amazing statement that was just not right, and Pete just turned around and went, Nicola, of course, is right that nuclear energy is better than fossil fuels, and actually that's something that we should expand on in the debate. And actually the motion passed on that basis. You know, Pete was also very encouraging of women always. In the days of the MSF, it was a male-dominated union. He always thought about bringing women forward, always. And I shall miss him both as a mentor and a good friend over so many years.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I'm now calling Lee Sustar, followed by Christina and Doug.
Thanks, Pat. There's so many moving things that friends and comrades and loved ones of Pete have shared today. I don't really have so much to add, but the description of fighting the far right brought home a memory of fighting in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, in the aftermath of a racist murder. That for weeks, every Saturday morning, Pete and other comrades would go down to march through a racist neighborhood and hear racist insults, physical threats, and more than one altercation. And we did it despite small numbers, despite other people with us being overwhelmed, because it was the struggle that was in front of us, and it was the right thing to do. It was a question of principle. And that's how I remember Pete and fighting. And another moment, in fact, that same year, a difficult moment for anybody who was around at that time, June 4th, 1989, which was the Tiananmen Square massacre, of course. And in those days before the internet, we didn't know exactly what was happening. It was a Sunday. The ISO branch met that day. We got hold of BBC. We got the latest papers that we could, and gradually the horror of that picture unfolded. And I remember Pete at that moment was the first really to grasp the enormity of that. And was a steadying influence for all of us young comrades. And it was a steadying of an influence based on the long-term view of the struggle that he had assimilated in his life, but that he had absorbed through his deep understanding of working class history and his abiding connection to the Marxist tradition. And that, I think, that moment really crystallized what he brought to comrades in New York, who were much less experienced and didn't have that same kind of struggle. And I think that the comrades who've all spoken did that. But what I appreciate most about Pete, and what has come across the moment, is that we would all wish to have bigger forces on our side. We'd all wish to be the heights of the battle. We are where we are. We have to get busy doing what we're doing. And we have to live life to the fullest as we have. And Pete, thank you for that. Jill, our heart goes out for you and everyone else who's lost a loved one, friend, and comrade. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lee. We now have Christina and Doug, followed by Nick Evans. Christina and Doug. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry,
right.
we were struggling
sorry
with the
about,
unmuting.
Sorry about that. I'm Doug, and Christina is to my right, which is frequently where she positions herself.
Yes.
A couple of days ago, I was outside Hackney Town Hall on a demonstration called by the NEU, Education Union, about about testing, about forcing teachers to work in unsafe conditions, which is what looks as though what the government is doing. The point being here that I was with people that Pete and I have had profound differences with in the past, and will probably continue to do so in the future. But there comes a time when you have to know what side you're on. You have to know who's going to be on the same side of the barricade as you. And you may argue with them, but that's where the acid test is. Who is going to be on your side? Who is going to defend you against what is against the attacks that are being made? From that, I go back the first time I saw Pete, and he was unkindly referred to. He wasn't, when I first saw him, wasn't able to dress quite as well as he did in the ensuing years, and some issues of washing were referred to when he visited us at Lancaster in our occupation about 150 years ago. It's great affection and solidarity.
Got 30 seconds, Doug.
I was going to finish, actually, Pat. Okay. Thank you very much.
Can I have just a minute?
Yeah. Christina wants to speak for a moment.
Just a quick sec, because I'm the one over here on the right. My memories of Pete are not about political engagement, because that was not how I knew him. I know him through Doug. But we were very, very involved in facilitating the move to Ludlow through our care of the 3 very charming cats. And I have a couple of quick memories. One is of going around with a list of how to feed the cats. Pete and Jill were up in Ludlow. We lived 2 streets away. We went around to feed the cats. One cat had to be fed first and shut in one room because the other cat would quite like that's what cat's food. But then the 3rd cat would come in, and the 3rd cat was allergic to the 2nd cat's food. So the 2nd cat had to be fed before the 3rd cat could be fed. Anyway, it all worked. And the second memory was of driving Jill in the back seat of our car with 3 cat baskets with Cal, Dusty, and Tiddles, stopping a couple of points along the way, and with Pete keeping in touch through his smartphone with our progress all the way from Osbaldeston Road up to Ludlow, and checking in on our progress and the progress of the 3 cats the whole way. The cats would be very quiet on the motorway. We got off the motorway, and every time we went around a roundabout, they'd all wake up, and then they'd go back to sleep again.
They were incontinent.
A little bit so. And then there'd be another roundabout, and they'd all wake up. So that was my contribution to facilitating the move from Hackney to Ludlow, and many, many happy memories as well.
Thank you very much. We're going to have 2 more speakers, and then we will have informal chat. And just to warn the speakers, because I think what happened with Christina and Doug was we're unmuting you centrally. So if you then think you're unmuting yourself, you're probably muting yourself. So it's Nick Evans followed by Mary Littlefield.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm sorry, it's not Nick, it's Sophie, but Nick's in the background. And I just wanted to say a few words about kind of personally how inspirational Jill and Pete were to me, particularly in the NHS activism, and how every time I saw Pete, he would always say to me, "Sophie, why are you not a member of Doctors in Unite?" And he would have this same argument with me, and he was always right. And I had to, he was also just so interested, so a fantastic person to have an argument with. I've learned a lot from him, but he was also just interested in the personal and in what the two of us were doing in our lives, and he wove together what was so important about politics with everyone's personal life. And then I also just wanted to share kind of a small story that touches a bit on what Cheryl was saying, that I shared the sad news of Pete's death with Docs Not Cops, which is an organisation that I'm involved in. And there's another person, James, who's also in this call, who does a lot of work for Docs Not Cops. And just sharing the sad news with them, and how so many people felt that Pete had taught them, had been a real inspiration in NHS activism, and it's, the fact that he was such a presence through both Keep Our NHS Public and all the meetings that we were present at together, that even though they might not have known him personally, that he shared a lot with them. So anyway, thank you very much for putting this memorial together, and thanks.
Thanks very much, Sophie. And our final speaker is Mary Littlefield.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. My memories of Pete go back a very long way, because I joined IS in 1973 at Leeds. Like Charlie, we were members of the Leeds student branch of IS, which was fantastically successful and really large. And I learned so much from Pete. And I think the thing I want to say is that I was a bit of a dippy hippie. People didn't think I was anything serious, really. But I didn't know who this Trotsky person was that everyone kept talking about. So I went and got a book out of the library, which is Isaac Deutsch's 3-volume trilogy about Trotsky. And I was reading it in the coffee bar at Leeds University, and Pete came and saw me and thought, I guess he thought she must be fairly serious if she's reading about Trotsky. And he came and talked to me, and he always encouraged me to read. Fantastic mentor, politically, and he was just such fun to be with. And I don't see him very often. I never saw him very often. We'd meet once a year at a demo, literally. And I would always go up and we'd say hello, and he'd give me this enormous hug. And I tell you, I'm going to miss, even though it was maybe once a year, I'm really going to miss those hugs. And he's been very much part of my life since 1973. And Jill, I'm sorry, it must be awful. I really do miss him. And he was a great comrade, and he taught so many people so much. So thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you, everyone. All the speakers were incredibly disciplined about the 2 minutes. We managed to get in almost everyone. Sorry to anyone we can't, but there is now a chance for informal chat. We're going to have a last piece of music, and we'd like you again to set your neighbours wondering and invite you to join in. And then the event formally ends. But the call will be left open with everybody able to unmute themselves so people can chat informally rather than being left on their own. So we're now going to have the final piece of music, Solidarity Forever.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made, but the Union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the Union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the Union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the Union makes us strong. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of atoms, magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the Union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the Union makes us strong.
Thank you very much, everyone. I hope that you feel that in the difficult circumstances we have, we've done justice to Pete tonight, and I hope you found this a rewarding event. And thank you all very much for coming. We're now going to unmute you all. The formal event is over. You can feel free to chat. Thank you.